So it's a Friday, March the 16th. I am Boasting Omafaya with your Business Morning. The 55 African heads of state and government are converging in Kigali, the Rwandan capital, next Wednesday to sign a historic agreement that would establish the Continental Free Trade Area, or CFTA. This follows the meeting of African ministers of trade held in Niger Republic last December, where they approved the broad structure of the trade agreement and considered the progress made in the negotiations preparatory to the summit of heads of state and government held in January this year. When signed on March 21st, the Continental Free Trade Area will be the biggest trade agreement, bringing together 55 African countries, second in size to the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. So 2 days ago, Nigeria's federal cabinet gave President Muhammadu Buhari to go ahead to Kigali next week and sign the landmark Continental Free Trade Agreement. The Federal Executive Council also okays President Buhari's team to lobby for the hosting of the Secretariat here in Nigeria. On his way now to Kigali, Rwanda, Nigeria's chief trade negotiator and the Director General of Nigeria Office for Trade Negotiation, Ambassador Chiedu Osakwe, is here in our studios for a stopover exclusive interview. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador, and it's good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
This is a very historic moment, and you're en route, so we appreciate the fact that you could stop over in Lagos for this interview with Channels Television on the eve of this agreement. So it's very important to look at the countdown, unwrap this Africa Continental Free Trade deal for us.
Well, thank you. At the very beginning, one must say that this is a big win for our president. This is a big win for President Buhari. Remember that the original decision by the African Union heads of state and government to have a CFTA, to have a free trade area covering the continent, was taken in 2012, even before the incumbent government led by our President Buhari. And then the actual negotiations were launched in Johannesburg, also at the summit of African Union heads of state and government in 2015. But really nothing was done until basically a year and a half ago. And we got our marching orders from the president, and he talked with a number of his other colleagues, and we got instructions to go ahead. On the 23rd of February last year, we got our instructions and our negotiating mandate from His Excellency the President. We then, at Nigeria, got elected to chair the technical work at my level, at the level of chief trade negotiators, and then at the ministerial level, chaired by Minister Okechukwu Enalama. So we pushed hard, we pushed very hard, and we built consensus. It's not easy to do that for 55 countries at different levels of economic development on the continent. So this is the background. Major win for our trade policy, major win for our economic policy, major win for our geopolitical presence on the continent as Africa's primary economic power and the 26th largest economy in the world. But basically, there's still a lot of work to do.
Yes, and still unwrapping and taking us down the road to Kigali. 55 African countries, various economic groupings within the sub-region, the ECOWAS, the SADC, the EAC, and COMESA, and what have you, different languages and whatever, and different national economic and trade deals or positions that will have to be submitted for a bigger and broader sub-Saharan Africa or entire Pan-African trade. How difficult was this deal culminating in the CFTA?
Well, you've described it well. Pretty tough. One of the major gains from the African Continental Free Trade Area has to be put in a historical perspective. Remember, the history of our continent, which basically still continues, is that of fragmented economies. Arabophones versus Usophones versus Francophones, Afrancophones versus Anglophones. This is a colonial inheritance. And so you have an inheritance of a divided continent, a polarized continent, and a fragmented economy on the continent. So one major gain, and this everyone is cheering to the rafters on this, is that the CFTA will have a unifying effect on the continent by creating, and this is not rhetorical, by creating a single market for trading goods and services. And then in stage 2 of the negotiations, we will move into the negotiations for competition, investment, and intellectual property. So a first major gain is in terms of unifying the continent and integrating the market. But there are a range of other gains, and I'm happy to talk to you about that when you're ready to take me up on that.
A very lengthy conversation. We're keeping you here as much as we can today before you continue on this journey. But Africa signing this historical landmark agreement, and you talk about but look at institutions on the continent. Many years after the World Trade Organization, of which a number of African economies and states belonged, but we've not really been able to submit to a common trade. And if you look at the European Union, for example, we're talking about NAFTA today, and with the Asia Pacific, Africa seems to be the only part of the world where a common free trade isn't really in place.
You're right. And it's a consequence of dividing the continent and ruling it by outsiders. And this is basically what we've had on the continent. Now, we're not going to die in the ditch crying over this. The most important thing is to do something about it. And this is what the African Continental Free Trade Area is doing. I loved your starting point. Your starting point was your description of the 7 regional economic communities on the continent. Remember, even though the oldest customs union in the global economy, by the way, is the South African Customs Union, dating back to 1804.
The COSATU.
Exactly. But what you've had since then, it's been, the term by economists is the spaghetti bowl, overlapping, duplicative, going at cross purposes. And so the CFTA is an unraveling process. Remember, the African Continental Free Trade Area will cover 1.2 billion people on the continent, constituting 14% of the global population. But fast forward to 2050, according to the data we have from the UN Population Organization, you would have a continent with a double population of approximately 4 billion people. So a large continental free trade area, the largest it would be in the world. Secondly, the economy, the GDP of the African continent currently stands at 2.5 trillion US dollars. Fast forward to 2050, the estimates we have from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa is that we'll be looking at a 29 trillion US dollar economy on the African continent. And we'll still need to download this for what it means for Nigeria, and the gains for Nigeria will be considerably huge. So in terms of coverage, by population, by number of countries, by GDP, it's massive. It will play a huge role in the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of the global economy.